Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. Well, Paul, it is ironic that we spoke just yesterday, a day ago, on the West's desperation for the Ukraine conflict to keep on going indefinitely. But something happened yesterday evening which could flip this entire scenario completely on its head.
Yeah, absolutely. And this was always this situation where, from the Americans' perspective, particularly, they cannot be in a situation where this war ends in total capitulation for Ukraine. And we talked about this previously. I'm not going to repeat what we've already said, but the nuts and bolts of it is because it would be utter humiliation for the United States. They would look extremely weak. They would look like the naked emperor, which effectively they are anyway. But if, and this has always been the US's perspective, if they can get a deal struck between the Russians and the Ukrainians to end the war, then the Americans will sit there and go, we did this, we were the ones who instigated this, we're the basically the catalyst to end the war, and they can leave the field of conflict with their heads held high from their perspective and thinking nobody will remember the absolute debacle that the Ukraine war was, whether it was what happened on the battlefield, whether it relates to sanctions, etc., etc. And because the US cannot, from their perspective, have a situation where they would just look like total abject failures, which they still are. It doesn't matter whether they can pull it off and suggest to people that they were the catalyst, they were the ones who made an agreement happen. But clearly, it's we talked about this for quite a considerable period of time. There has been suggestions and discussions for quite some time that the Americans, particularly, wanted to see an alternative Ukrainian president. They wanted Zelensky to step down, disappear, because they perceive him to be a liability rather than an asset. And that was even straddling the Biden administration. Well, I thought it was worth at this point making reference, and you can tell people what was said, Ken, with respect to Seymour Hersh, who made a post on Substack which talked about Zelensky. So I'll pass over to you.
Yeah, it's just to preface it in the beginning, earlier this week, or I should say later in the week, about Thursday or Friday, President Trump was taking on a press conference, an interview, and they were asking him about Ukraine and Putin. And of course, he just gave his usual rhetoric about, you know, we thought we could trust and Putin is all words and he's doing stuff behind our back and he's not. Well, the reality is that Trump has to portray, at least on the surface, that he's anti-Russia, anti-Putin. Otherwise, the media and everyone else would go against him. But it looks like, according to Seymour Hersh, some of his Washington sources have talked about that the U.S. right now is working towards finding a credible successor to Zelensky, getting him out of there, because he knows as long as Zelensky is running around and trying to keep and hold his position, that he's not going to allow the conflict really to come to any resolution. So it's interesting that Hersh comes out that the U.S. is now viably looking at ways to go ahead and change the leadership in Ukraine, obviously in the hopes that Putin will see this as a positive and stop the attacks, come to the table with a ceasefire, and then hopefully some type of resolution that President Trump can claim a win will come from it.
Yeah, absolutely. And subsequent to this, there was Zelensky suddenly came out where there doesn't seem to have been any noises to the affirmative to want to have what would be a third meeting with the Ukrainians and the Russians to thrash out some kind of way to end the war. And suddenly Zelensky's desperate to do so and would like to do so next week. And you have to wonder if what Seymour Hersh said, it ties in with this, and so because Zelensky is all about self-preservation, and he might suddenly think, well, if I bring an end to the war, then the Americans will be happy with me, and I can stay in office. Now, we're not here to deliberate specifically whether Zelensky will be in office in 2 months, 6 months, or whatever. I think, irrespective, the Americans would still want Zelensky to step down, disappear wherever he's going to disappear to, and let an alternative, who the belief is Zelensky, to become the Russian president. I guess that's in the caretaker role, given, of course, effectively Ukraine doesn't have a government anymore in any way, shape, or form, not a legitimate one either, based on the constitution, because Zelensky's term of office has long since expired. And quite tellingly as well, is we started to hear some sort of positive noises coming out of Russia, with Putin going, yes, we're happy to engage in further negotiations and discussions with the Ukrainians. And in fact, only I think a few days ago, Lavrov was saying to the Europeans and the West, look, please encourage the Ukrainians to come to the table, because this third meeting was very much in doubt, and there didn't seem to be any impetus from the Ukrainians to want to proceed on that basis. Now, all of a sudden, yes, they do. And I think there has been discussions had between the Russians, the Americans, along the lines of, look, we're going to try and force the issue with Zelensky. I mean, this could be a bluff call, of course. It might not actually mean anything in reality, but Zelensky doesn't know that, but maybe it is true. And they'll say to the Russians, look, we're going to put pressure on him. We'd rather he step down. We want someone else in. If we put this out, you make some noises as well, and we'll twist their arm to get to the negotiating table. Now, of course, this alone doesn't mean anything. They could get to the negotiating table and we just hit a brick wall. They might never get to the negotiating table. It's all at the moment up in the air till a meeting actually happens. We can't really say what the outcome, of course, will be. But the question, therefore, always then comes back to the point. If the Americans want to get a win out of this from their perspective, and maybe they can fool a few other, Western countries in the process, it comes back to the point of what Russia's core issues that need to be addressed are. And we don't need to go through every single exhaustive line item, but I think we should pick on a few. So before we get into that, Ken, I'll pass over to you for your comments.
Yeah, the one thing that stands out is, obviously there is rhetoric from all sides. Except, not very often is there rhetoric that comes from President Putin or Lavrov. They usually just stick to what they said at the beginning. These are our goals, these are our agendas, this is what we want, this is what we demand, and we're not going to stop until it gets done. So set that aside. That's the baseline. Obviously, the United States and Europe have been all over the map continuously, but it's the times when Zelensky, who demands that we have a ceasefire, and then of course when they get to the ceasefire, they're not willing to give up anything, and they're demanding that Russia give back everything that they've taken, and so it's been absolutely meaningless. I think the big difference this time is that Zelensky no longer has any leverage. Zero, zip. Kursk is gone. Pokrovsk, if you remember from a discussion you and I had a few months ago, I said, if this is anything like World War One, once the Hindenburg line, or in this case, Pokrovsk, forgive my pronunciation, once that last line of defense is breached, then you're talking only months before capitulation. And now we're seeing that time period. So it's not out of the realm that this is what they're doing, because Russia is pretty much moving as they see fit into further places outside of Donetsk and the Donbass. And also now, for the first time, they are starting to use missile and drone attacks on Kiev and places that they never did the first couple years of the war. So Zelensky was feeling protected. Oh, they're not attacking the capital. They're not attacking some of our um, forward operating bases, et cetera, et cetera. Now they are. And so Zelensky is running out of places to hide. He's got no leverage. He can't walk up to the table and say, "You give us back Crimea and we'll give you back this." They have nothing. So really, they're at a point that Zelensky has to be looking at his self-preservation rather than acting as a leader who's got something that he can make in trade or offer.
Yeah, absolutely. One point I would add to this, and I don't think this is a coincidence either, that we had Trump going, we're going to, give Ukraine armaments because he felt besmirched by Putin ignoring him, basically. And then suddenly it was, well, actually, we've got nothing to give them, really. Europe, what have you got to give them? Give them all your Patriot missile defense system, give them the Patriot interceptors, and they're going, we haven't got much either. Oh. And I think this is suddenly the realization. They're all sat there going, we've got nothing to give Ukraine. So if this war carries on much longer, the risk is it will be total capitulation. And then we're back to the whole discussion we had yesterday, which people I recommend they haven't listened to it, go and listen to it, because I'm not going to go through all that and repeat what we said 24 hours ago. So then it comes on to the point of reaching an agreement. Now, Russia's position has never changed in 3.5 years. The only thing that's changed is additional territory. At the start, when they had an agreement notionally in place to Ukraine in April 2022, it didn't include any territory. It was that they, had autonomy, they were independence, but Donetsk and Lugansk were not, as part of that agreement, to be part of the Russian Federation. Well, now, as far as Russia's concerned, they are, as is Kherson, as is Zaporozhye. So they are obviously territories that are non-negotiable. That wasn't previously the case. But in a broad sense, it's what we've always said. It's obviously demilitarization, it's neutrality, it's no, not a member of NATO, no nuclear weapons, etc., etc. Now, in order for an agreement to be reached, it's not only Ukraine who will have to accept these territories are now part of Russia, but so will the Europeans and so will the United States. Now, I don't think the US particularly would necessarily care anymore because they just want a way out. They want to be able to, as soon as possible, pretend Ukraine never happened. They don't want anything to do with it. They want to imagine in their minds that it's someone else's problem now. Just walk away because it's totally humiliating to the US what's happened. With the Europeans, we go back to what we said yesterday. So, in essence, if an agreement can be reached, and it is reached on the basis of what the Russians are demanding, I think the Americans will also see it as an opportunity to then go, look, we did stop the war. Look, cheerleading our wonderful peacekeeping president. And in the process, they'll throw Biden under the bus, his administration. And I think they'll also throw the Europeans under the bus. Because we're back to this point, the United States would like to see a radically different political structure across all of Europe. They would like to see presidents in place who are very pro-American, who pro-Israel, and who would obviously more be interested in taking a Trump-type approach to geopolitics, to economics, to finance. So they're not going to be the Atlanticists who are in Brussels now. They don't like those because they're Atlanticists for not what Trump stands for, but or his administration or what his current US policy. Because again, ultimately, is Trump really the president? And my belief in that is no, he isn't. So it's whoever has a vested interest to run America a different way now is not in agreement with the way America was run by these Atlanticists, or Europe was run by these Atlanticists. in Brussels. So they would see it as a great opportunity for a new broom to sweep all before it, and therefore, as we say, throw the Europeans under the bus, change things politically via new elections, where the belief is then the people will vote differently. And it's a win-win as far as the US is concerned. And if they have to make some concessions, well, knowing the Americans the way they are, they'll go, well, we'll agree to this. In 10 years, we'll get a different, or 5 years, we'll have a different Russian president. They'll probably think differently. And we can come back to this in the future and change all the agreement. But the agreement from Russia's perspective, you would arguably have to say, is that these territories are part of Russia. If you are to invade them, that is a declaration of war. And if it was Western forces who are responsible for doing it, that is a declaration of war effectively by NATO or NATO countries against Russia. Or if it's Ukraine, it's the same perspective, because they want these territories recognized internationally in law. No ambiguity. No, oh, well, we'll agree to it. Maybe we'll find a written agreement in the future. This not these vague, woolly agreements Russia's had in the past that meant nothing, and they were subsequently torn up, including, of course, NATO expansion east, and that whole disagreement between whether the Americans agreed to something or didn't agree to something. There was no law put in place, no treaty was put in place to that effect. So you would expect Russia to demand that in the future. And as for the other aspects of this, well, the argument that will come out of the United States will be as well, the sooner we do this, the less territory Russia will have, because what they'll get Dnipro next, or Sumy, maybe Kharkov, maybe eventually Nikolaev and Odessa. If they take Odessa and Nikolaev, then it's landlocked. Ukraine becomes completely useless. So they may have some ideas about we can revisit this in the future, and to be able to find a way to remedy what they would be perceived to be a short-term problem, be it 5, 10, 15, who knows, years. And maybe in the future, no one will care anyway, and everyone will just want to walk away from Ukraine and pretend it's someone else's problem. What happens domestically for Ukraine, as we said yesterday, is hugely important. It's never discussed. And that is something that everyone's going to have to take consideration of, because the country's in total collapse. And by all accounts, the Ukrainian people are increasingly completely fed up and want the war to end and want peace, because they realize the absurdity of this war carrying on. And it's a war, of course, they can't win. So I think from my perspective, we'll see what happens. If there is a meeting, are they going to reach an agreement based on what Russia's stating? But I think the way the Americans are now, they just want it over. So just give what the Russians want. We'll spin it some way. We'll find a way of blaming someone else. And as long as we walk away from this debacle with our reputation intact, who cares? Europe has to get thrown under the bus. Great. We don't like them anyway. And if there's political ramifications, including governments or traditional governments not being elected, and some populist parties and people we'd like to see in government across Europe, then that's a win for them. So I think that's the feeling. And certainly it seems as though everything's stacking up for Zelensky to make the decision. This is your last chance. You either get to the negotiating table, reach an agreement, or we'll find a way to force you to step down and put someone in who's prepared to do that. So what choice has Zelensky got? He can either step down, walk away, which he probably should have long since done, but he wants to survive and he wants to stay president. He thinks he can be president in the future, which of course is ridiculous, because the Ukrainian people are not going to vote him in when there's next legitimate elections in Ukraine, whenever that may come to pass. So I think this is a watershed moment, and if an agreement's reached, the war could end very, very rapidly. And then the huge problems begin internally in Ukraine. But America doesn't care about that. this minerals agreement will just become an afterthought that's never discussed ever again because it'll never come to pass. And the question then of who's paying for things in the future, the reconstruction of Ukraine, all those really difficult discussions will have to be had. But that's, I think, a discussion for another day and not something to try and tag on the end of what we've said today. And as usual, this is a brief synopsis. We are not discussing things exhaustively because people don't want to listen to us talking for 2 hours because they get bored, and that's fine. So we're just giving you the very basic outline with some detail, and the rest of the detail belongs in future discussions or in other podcasts and things that I work on independently from YouTube. And I'll pass you over to Ken for his, I guess, final thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. And for anybody who hasn't, make sure to subscribe with the Sirius Report. Go over to the SiriusReport.com, subscribe there, and get more insight from Paul's perspective. No, I think we covered it. It's kind of interesting. We're at that point in history where, you know, they used to say sometimes decades go without anything happening, and then weeks happen, or years happen in just a week. And I think this is one of those scenarios where we analyzed yesterday the ramifications of the Ukraine conflict and why it has to be extended with from Europe's side of the spectrum, and then instantaneously we take a look at the reality where Zelensky goes, you know what, I got to get out of Dodge, and we got to figure out how to deal this one day later. So really fascinating. Things are going fluid. Paul, as always, I want to thank you for being a part of the discussion and for your insight regarding this.
Yes, and likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report, thank you as always for your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.